Welcome to Chapter 2 on the Founding and the Constitution. So the first thing we want to look at is who were these folks that came over here from Europe to start a new life in the New World. So as you can see here, often refer to them as the separatists. So you can see that word even today, where say, for example, in some other country, there might be two religious groups, and the minority religious group no longer wants to be a part of the main country. They might try to separate from that main country, and we would also refer to them as separatists. So you can see this has, again, a lot to do with religion here. So over in England, the Church of England was really the only game in town. So if they wanted to practice their religion the way they wanted to, they figured, well, hey, maybe it's best for us to leave and try something else in a different area. So, people had been to the New World before, and they thought, well, this could be a good opportunity for us to practice their religious beliefs the way they saw fit. So if you remember in class, we talked about a couple different words for these folks. We also refer to as separatists. So both start with a P. Of course, the one would be pilgrims. Think about Thanksgiving, all that good stuff. Then, of course, the other one, sometimes, again, you still hear this word sometimes used in our society today, is the Puritans, right? So pilgrims and Puritans, a couple other ways to refer to the separatists. All right. So again, if you think about like what was going on in England, of course, the King of England is in charge over there. So what we see here is the first time where people have this new idea of the consent of the governed, where the people really should have a say in what's going on in their government. So the first sort of looking at social and civil rights. Like I said, over in England, the king of England is not going to care about people's social and civil rights. He's the king. So one of the things we want to finish off on in this slide, and I think it's interesting to look at before the country ever started, is that the colonies had very diverse histories and economies. So you can see here very little interest in joining together until about the 1750s. So if you remember, the Declaration of Independence is 1776. So we're about 25 years before that, we see the colonies start having a little more interest in coming together. So one of the reasons for that is it was very much like apples and oranges. If you sort of think about the economy of maybe someplace like South Carolina, right, very agriculture based, sort of the idea of, the plantation economy with the slaves working the field and for cotton and tobacco, those type of things. Of course, that's going to be very different than what was going on in New York. So in a lot of ways, you just sort of think of it like each colony was more like its own country. People would have thought of themselves as that way, like a New York colonist or a Pennsylvania colonist, something like that. They wouldn't have really thought about themselves as, anywhere near like being an American yet. Okay, so then we look at what were some of the reasons to start bringing them together, right? So again, you see we're about 13 years before the Declaration here, 1763. So the British Parliament started to treat the 13 colonies like they were one country. Or like they were one unit. Sorry, not one country. So instead of passing individual laws on the different colonies, they just would kind of do these blanket things like the Tea Act, the Sugar Act, Stamp Act. Now it says Act here for these three things, but all these are taxes. So again, taxes on these things that people would have used in their daily lives. So you can see, why that would have been upsetting to the colonists at that time. So then we look at, well, why would the British ever have done that in the first place? They did have a reason for it. So they had a lot of debt, had a lot of money that they had racked up fighting in the French and Indian Wars here. So again, you can see it started about 20 years before the Declaration of Independence, 1756 to 63. So again, that's a long time to fight a war, particularly all the way on the other side of the ocean. So if you put what they owed in today's money, it would be in the billions and billions of dollars. So you can see why they did have at least some kind of a reason to try to get some extra money out of the colonists. Say, maybe they can help us pay back this debt. Because in their perspective, hey, they had just been fighting to keep this place English, right? Who knows if things had gone differently? Who knows? If France had controlled this area, maybe we'd all be speaking French today instead of English. All right, so then we're kind of going to move forward a little bit, so getting towards the Declaration of Independence. So initially, again, think about these people would have thought of themselves as British. They would have spoke English, of course, and all that. So the idea was, nobody was really talking about starting their own country at the very beginning. The idea was more that they wanted to restore the political structure before they passed these laws, these different legislations that affect the internal operations of each colony. Nobody was talking about having a Declaration of Independence at that time. So you can see it's a pretty small group here. Just 56 delegates, so everybody but Georgia. So everybody but Georgia sent representatives to the First Continental Congress. So again, a pretty small group, right? 56 delegates. So again, think about these are not folks that would be really representative of the population in general. Again, everybody's going to be white in that room at the time, male, wealthy, often people with owning lots of land, these kind of things. So the point is, they're not the sort of poor farmer guy, the poor fisherman guy that would be at this meeting. So then just put a little, sort of interesting thing to think about. It says, had the Crown and Parliament relented on their demands, say, for example, if they had given in to what the colonists were asking them to do, who knows? Then it's possible that the Declaration of Independence never would have been issued, or maybe history would have unfolded differently than it did. So just a brief side thing. So I want you to see some of the connection from back then until today. So of course, this is a current Washington, D.C. license plate, right? District of Columbia. So we looked at, well, why does it have taxation without representation on there? So again, think about, so we have, of course, have the 50 states and then D.C., Washington, D.C. So there's the argument in D.C. that they get less representation than do people in the states. Because, of course, they don't have the 2 senators, like we would in North Carolina or Virginia or elsewhere. And they do have a congressional representative, but that person is a non-voting member. She can only get involved in some of the administrative issues. So that's why DC folks say, hey, we're paying the same money, paying the same taxes as other people, but we don't have the same representation. So this is an important slogan or phrase, right? Taxation without representation. So if there's anything to know about why were the colonists upset at the British? What were they really angry about? It was this whole idea of taxation without representation, right? Feeling like they're paying tax money, but they don't have any representation in government. So of course, the demands are not met after the First Continental Congress. So then they try, let's meet again, push it a little further. So the Second Continental Congress, you start seeing some things that sound a little bit more like things a country would have. So it established an army, said, hey, maybe we need somebody to lead that army. So George Washington becomes the general, and we pursue the Revolutionary War. Now I put this term in here, commander-in-chief, because again, that's what Washington was called at that time. But remember, so he doesn't become president until much later, way down the road in 1789, after the Constitution. But we still use the term commander-in-chief today, of course, to refer to the president, because he or she is in charge of the armed forces. So the president is also called commander-in-chief. All right, so then, of course, the demands aren't met then either, so we decided to move forward with the Declaration of Independence. Oh, I meant to say earlier that the First Continental Congress, just so have a little bit of a timeline in your head, so that was 1774, right? So a couple years before the Declaration. All right, so then you can see some of our concepts from Chapter 1 coming back in, right? So influence of John Locke. So the idea of natural rights found their way into the Declaration: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? So Thomas Jefferson, of course, is the main guy who writes the Declaration, the main author of the Declaration of Independence. So, of course, he changes life, liberty, and property, changes the property into pursuit of happiness. So one of the major reasons for that was because slavery, of course, was in full effect in this country at that time. So, not everyone had the right to property, of course. Jefferson knew that would be problematic to include. Then we also see, the Declaration of Independence speaks to the social contract. Of course, that's the relationship or the kind of unwritten agreement between the people or the citizens and the government. The agreement between the citizens and the government. All right. So then, of course, date adopted. We don't need to know tons of names and dates and things for the class, but there are some I'd like you to know. So, of course, this one's July 4th, 1776. Of course, we celebrate that every year. In some ways, you can think about that as kind of the nation's birthday, right? Saying that, hey, we're no longer going to be, a British colony. Now, so you can see I put this 1776 in there, but remember, it's not like the British just pack up and go home. They're going to actively fight to try to keep this area. So the Revolutionary War doesn't end until the early 1780s. It takes a while for that war to actually play out and for the United States to truly gain its independence. So the next slide we're looking at is the rise of republicanism. Just again, with a different kind of perspective. So if you think about back at those times, starting up a new country, obviously people are going to have really different ideas about what that country should look like. Who should make the decisions, all those kind of things. So one of the key things we're looking at with this issue is republicanism that we're talking about here has absolutely nothing to do with the Republican Party of today. Again, this is 2015. The Republican Party that we know today doesn't come in until much, much later. So just wanted to make sure everybody was clear that these are, very different things. So what are we talking about with this republicanism back in these days? So these are people that, again, nobody wanted to be ruled by the British anymore, but they were also skeptical or kind of opposed to any rule by what we call a central authority. Or we think about like a strong national government making decisions for everyone. So you can see here, even skeptical of a permanent union of the states. They liked all the states getting along and doing well together, but skeptical of this idea of a United States. They were more comfortable with each state having its own sovereign authority, managing its own affairs. And you think about it, that makes a lot of sense in some ways at that time, where that's what they had been used to doing, right? Like I said, each colony was more like its own country. So, once we kind of transition over towards forming the United States, a lot of people feel much more comfortable keeping that system and say, hey, this kind of worked before for us. Why don't we just keep that system going? All right, so then a lot of people forget that we even had these because it was so long ago. But remember, we did have what we call the first form of government, and these are called the Articles of Confederation. So we just put up on an earlier slide that the Declaration of Independence is from 1776, of course, but then the Constitution doesn't come in. So Constitution, they don't start writing until 1787. So if you think about, well, there must have been something that we were using in that period before the Constitution. It was this here, right? The Articles of Confederation. So you can see, some things already that a little different than what we're used to today. So under this form of government, states had most of the power, right? States had most of the power, not the national government. People would have been much more loyal to their state. Nobody really would have been talking about being an American yet at that time. That sort of identity hadn't really developed yet. Your textbook uses this idea of a league of friendship, and I think that's a nice way to describe it. They were familiar with each other, they liked each other, but more like friends than family. So today, of course, you can see some of the differences where, if you look at, well, where is the power at? Is it at the state level or is it at the national level? Of course, today, we'd say probably the national level has more power. So you can see that's a huge difference from this Articles of Confederation. So you can think about the Articles as a bit of trial and error. They kind of saw what worked, what didn't work, and then so the Constitution was able to fix some of the issues they had with the Articles of Confederation. All right. So here's the confederal structure, right? How do things work under the Articles of Confederation? So we'll come back to this in a second. But remember, there's just one branch of government at this time. Congress had one chamber. That's all it is. That's all it is. There's no president. There's no Supreme Court. None of those kind of things. So again, very different than today. Then some other issues, you can see why they might have had a problem with something like an amendment. So again, to amend something just means to change or to update. So to get that done, to amend something, it required the consent of all of the states. So you can imagine, trying to get every single state to agree on something was extremely difficult to do. All right, so we're going to go ahead and end this video. So then video number 2 will pick up on the next slide.